Well, Nelson Mandela is a liberator and a hero to many, but to some, especially younger people, they're questioning his decisions. Tonight we hear from both sides. Our guests are Enhle Khumalo, a social entrepreneur, and Busisiwe Seabe, a student activist. Good evening. A very warm welcome to both of you. I believe you are not much of a fan. Why is that?
I'm not a fan of this Nelson Mandela that is being shoved down our throats. And I particularly say that because he has become more than just a global icon, but now he is essentially turning into some sort of a messiah that is supposed to, at the mention of his name, everything should be resolved. The racial tension in this country is something that can be resolved at the mention of his name. You know, the land redistribution debates are to be resolved at the mention of his name. So particularly the Mandela that was presented by former President Barack Obama, the one that believes in the liberal democracy, the one that essentially is a people for everyone, is the one that I wouldn't like to believe in, but one that, you know, Professor Lumumba had described, the Nelson Mandela that would have asked about land, the Nelson Mandela that would have made sure that post-1994 we got more than just political freedom in the sense of a vote. So
you believe that as the man himself, he could have achieved it, but it's what he's become that is obscuring or hindering any development? As a man himself, I don't think he would have achieved it anyhow. I mean, the legacy that everyone is so fascinated about that is centered around Nelson Mandela is it's not his personal legacy, but it's the legacy of the ANC. And we need to be able to look at it as a policy and the legacy of the ANC. Because a lot of what he fought for and a lot of what he represented, the founding fathers of the ANC, you know, represented and they came up with. So to a large extent, we're celebrating a legacy of a man who was unable to fulfill his mandate, and we're historicizing him and making him a messiah. And that for me is very problematic. And a messiah to you, possibly?
Well, I think it's worth noting that Nelson Mandela himself said that I am no saint. If anything, I'm a sinner who keeps on trying. And so I think it's easy to have a single narrative about, you know, Mandela the Messiah. And I think we need to critique why we had Mandela the Messiah. Obviously, we're not an ahistoric nation. We're deeply wounded. I mean, arguably, we're going through some post-traumatic stress. And so with that, we tend to create these caricatures of human beings. And therefore, we remove the personhood of Nelson Mandela and we create this messiah in order to sort of buffer or lessen the wounds of our pain. And I think it's worth critiquing why we decided to go with the Messiah dynamic and who controls these agendas, who decides that Nelson Mandela is a Messiah, and why do they have that agenda, and why do we follow the narrative?
The agenda is?
I mean, I think it's a loaded question in the sense that when you do create a deity of a person, particularly a black leader in a country that has gone through an apartheid period, it acts as destruction. And in a sense, then we're no longer critiquing things such as white monopoly capital because it becomes about Mandela's, you know, being the face of another note of money. We're no longer critiquing democracy and how it works with capitalism and how we can sort of create justice within that kind of system. And I think that it exonerates a lot of the leaders currently because we are distracted with the narrative that Mandela is a sellout.
Do you think he was a sellout? I mean, there's a lot of talk about that. Everyone's saying that he's not, but how does that even come about?
I mean, if we're going to say Nelson Mandela was a sellout, then to a large extent we might as well say his entire generation sold us out. Because, I mean, I'd love to believe, and I know as a fact, he wasn't the only one who was negotiating for us. And this is why I say...
He spent so many years in jail. He gave up seeing his family, gave up seeing his children grow up.
I think one fact that South Africa has to come to terms with is that Nelson Mandela was not the longest serving political prisoner of our time. There was a man who spent a period longer than Nelson Mandela. And of that 27 years, we also have to be realistic about the fact that he didn't spend all of it in prison. At some point, he was moved onto a private estate, and that on its own, to a large extent, according to the times and the conditions of prisoners at that time, and the black condition, was to some degree a privilege. And we need to be able to investigate that privilege and say, why was Nelson Mandela 18 years into prison, moved from being with the people, from being with his comrades, into a private facility where the only access, or people who could only access him, was the state? which becomes very problematic, which means these negotiations could have, it's a possibility, might not be a fact, could have started from before. So the problem with calling Nelson Mandela a sellout is that we absolve everyone else around him of the duty and the obligation that they had to the state and to themselves at the time. But at the same time, yes, he did sell us out.
Okay, we have a question from Paladi from Soweto. Paladi, who would you like to address your question to, and what is it?
Oh, okay. Yeah, basically I would like to address my question to the lady with a nice duke. I forgot her name. Not Seabe, the other one. Yeah.
Enhle.
Yes, yeah. Yes. My question is, why does people call Mandela a hero? Who does he represent specifically? Because if you look, people who appear on TV who talk a lot about Mandela, you talk about the Obamas or whosoever, those people are privileged. They haven't, basically Mandela they've been forward all along. So basically Mandela for them was more like a historian or somebody who existed and who conquered certain things, but they didn't experience. So my specific question is, why do they call him a hero, whereas he didn't benefit any ordinary South African, so to say?
Thank you, Paladi. Enhle?
I think it's important to really gauge the socio-political context of which Mandela was functioning in at the time. And I think it's also important to really critique the nature of negotiations. And as my colleague over here said, that Mandela wasn't working in isolation. He's very much part of a collective, and so we can't absolve other leaders of their role. And so when he went to the negotiation, you have to somewhat assume that he had a certain agenda that he was trying to push, which was a collectively agreed upon agenda. And so when you enter into a negotiation, there are two opposite sides, and usually two opposing sides. And if you're going to, the nature of a negotiation is that there must be some compromises. Otherwise, you don't enter into negotiation. You're likely not going to leave that table having reached every single objective of yours.
Is there a feeling that there's possibly too much compromise? And where does that leave the issue of land?
You don't compromise land. Historically, looking at why the liberation movement started, it wasn't centered around only getting political rights or being able to vote or being able to be considered as a human being in the country, but it had to do with culture, it had to do with identity, which we tie back to the land. And the land is not necessarily just the physical, arable land that we have. We mean the minerals, we mean the resources, we even mean the skies and the rivers.
But
so for Mandela to settle on that
equally argue that the Freedom Charter and the Constitution speak to these kind of values. And then, again, it's about exonerating our current leaders, because Mandela arguably set the foundation and set the tone for us to reach these objectives. And then what happens afterwards? Because Mandela was a president who ran for one term. But what happened afterwards? Why do we still not have the land? Why is the face of poverty still black?
All right, we've got a question, sorry, very quickly, from Thabo from Boksburg. Thabo, go ahead.
How are you?
Thabo?
Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear?
Yes,
hello,
we can hear.
Okay.
What's your question?
Okay, my question is, what I want to know is that why Utata Babu Mandela exactly, why he was arrested and taken to Robben Island? What was the main reason, actually?
Busisiwe, would you like to answer that?
I mean, the main reason was because he was considered to be a terrorist, right? He was considered to be a terrorist of the state. At the time, it was the apartheid government. He was a liberation, I wouldn't say leader, but he was a liberation member, because there were many leaders like Chris Hani, like Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, like Oliver Tambo, and so many others that were there. He becomes a significant member of the revolutionary movement that is turned into this icon, that is turned into this leader by Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, of which no one will speak about, right? If we're going to speak about the legacy of this country, and if we're honestly going to speak about the legacy of Nelson Mandela, we need to be able to engage, right? Not only his relationship with the mother of the nation, but his relationship with other comrades outside of the ANC, his relationship with parties like the PAC, his relationship with parties like the IFP, who were at the time fighting for the same thing, or supposedly fighting for the same thing. So when you look at the legacy of Nelson Mandela, it can't just be isolated to the beautiful moments that we've had, him uniting the country.
Too much was put on him. I mean, he was obviously a man of many parts, and he played many different roles. You can't be good at everything. Was
Certainly.
he not there for the peaceful transition that we saw at the time? Was that not enough?
So, you know, he's not a man with a magic wand, certainly not. I will concur that there are certain things that you do not compromise on, and I believe one of those things will land. Unfortunately, I was not at those negotiations, and so I do not know why we do not have the land. All I do know is my subjective reality as it stands, and that the land, which gives us life, also determines our economy, determines ownership. So I think Mandela, you know, as a man who was in a socio-politically really tough situation, I think he went to the negotiation table with the right intentions. Perhaps he did not come out with it the way he would like to, but he certainly did put forward a good...
You shaking your head?
I'm shaking my head because, I mean, let's look at how he came out of prison and what he did when he came out. He became a populist. He was flying across the world, meeting up with celebrities and heads of state. And yes, I do concur, he did have one term, but what did he do that was tangibly significant to the nation, to our people? I mean, he was involved in the structuring of our constitution, yet here we are trying to review and rewrite Section 25 in order for us to be able to get land redistribution without compensation. So for me, I don't believe that we had put too many expectations on him. I think that he failed to meet the expectations of a head of state of the first black liberated democratic state in Africa. This is something he should have expected. He should have expected that there would be a lot of pressure on him, and he had a team. Whether he was willing to use that team to the best of his ability is something that we are yet to see.
Okay, Payne from KZN, good to call us. What's your question? Hello, Payne, can you hear me? Do you have a question for us?
Hello, Payne, can you hear me? Do you have a question for us?
Hello, how are you?
Very good, thank you. Who's your question to and what is it, Payne?
Hello, how are you?
Very good, thank you. Who's your question to and what is it, Payne?
First, I want to make a comment.
Very good, thank you. Who's your question to and what is it, Payne?
First, I want...
Go ahead, please.
The first thing that we need to understand is that Mandela was a person just like all of us here. So we need to appreciate what he managed to accomplish as a human being. So for us to say that Mandela sold out, I think it's unfair for him. The question we need to ask ourselves is, what have we done? The question we need to ask ourselves is, what have we done around the areas where we live, around where...
Terrible sound issues there, Payne, so sorry to cut you off, but Enhle, maybe you can answer that. I mean, you know, I think he was pushing it forward, wasn't he, to what needs to be done now in order for the people of South Africa to make their own way, to overcome the economic disparities. Obviously, I'm adding to his question there, but what do you think?
I mean, everything is a trickle-down effect. Everything runs with systems which regulate our realities. And so I think we need to critique those very systems that I'm speaking of from the top down. And so not to isolate it necessarily to Nelson Mandela, but just as overall as a country. And so that means putting into question leadership. It means putting into question our role in society as citizens. And so it has a trickle-down effect to the results that will produce.
I mean, has the struggle morphed into an economic one now? I mean, is that the reality on the ground? Until we address that, South Africa will never be able to move forward, will never be able to address the race problems that we're seeing at the moment.
I mean, that's one of them, right? And one thing I do appreciate about Nelson Mandela is that in 1994, when he was coming out, he said what he was able to do was to give us freedom to fight for freedom. And that freedom that he was speaking about was political freedom, which means, you know, that political freedom would be able to get us, and it was a stepping stone for us to achieve economic freedom and every other freedom that comes after that. So I believe that what needs to happen from now on is we need to be able, as a country, outside and even including inclusive of political entities, be able to sit down and structure what this economic emancipation is going to look like. We need to be able to actively engage in it and start redistributing things like land, start including black people into the economy. I mean, it's absurd, the fact that this country is turning into a small Mandelaville. I mean, he's on our money, he's on our bridges, he's in schools. The next thing left for us to be calling the rand is we're going to be calling it the roli or the hloli hlahla. I mean, at this particular point in time, South Africa is turning into Mandela's personal, country, a country that to a large extent he contributed to, but we cannot say and we cannot assume that it started and it's going to end with him. There are other revolutionaries that walked before him.
Tourist attraction.
Exactly. We understand he's a tourist attraction.
Do we have a leader now who can move his positive legacy on? Who is it in your mind?
I think we need to really study whether politics is really the space in which we can redefine ourselves identity-wise, if we can really self-actualize as citizens through political parties. I do want to have faith that our current leadership will redirect the country in ways that it needs to go. I mean, the land question is something that is really pertinent, and it's something they're looking into through the Gauteng legislature and the constitution. And so I want to have faith and not be pessimistic, because with anger comes a lot of self-righteousness.
And do you think we have the tools at the moment to deal with this anger?
That's what Mandela gave us. So he gave us the foundation and the mechanisms necessary in order for us to have these conversations, have these debates and negotiations, so that we can redraft our reality, that from 1994 and 2018 must look different, and from 2018 to 2020 it must look different.
And where should South Africans look now?
At this particular point in time, us trying to have a second wave of reconciliation committee meetings is clearly not working in this country, because of the fact that we understand that forgiveness is not something that has been asked for, first of all, and it's not something that can just be given without, to a large extent, a genuine engagement. And that genuine engagement, for me as a black person, starts with, the returning of the land. And once we've been able to return the land, we should be able to use the institutions and to be able to use government as a tool to be able to move this country forward. We're way behind on where we should be 23 years after democracy. We're way behind countries such as Botswana, such as Lesotho, although they did not to a large extent face the same, as atrocities as we did. We're moving backwards instead of forwards, because everything we're supposed to have done in the first 10 years of our democracy has not been done, and is only being done now because the EFF has arrived and is starting to ask the important questions.
Moving forward is really impossible without justice. I think that's the moral.
Yeah. Those wise words, we'll leave it. Wonderful conversation. Thank you
very much.
both of you. That was a great chat.
Thank you.
Well, several books have been written about Madiba. When we return, we'll talk about the latest one, so do stay with us.